Okay, we are on. Let's see here. We are in the middle of chapter 5 of our discourse here. And last week we were just starting a new topic, which is always difficult because then you have to teach it again. 1 second. We basically we had a very long question, which almost took up like a good chunk of this chapter. And the question is basically asking, based on our understanding of God from chapter 4, and what we said previously with regards to the nature of God's knowing of the world, which we explained according to Kabbalah, takes place through a system called the Sfirot, called the Spheres, which we don't really have a translation for. Spheres is the English term, Sfirot is the Hebrew term. The spheres are the 10 tools, the 10 ways with which God interacts with the world, and the whole advantage of the spheres system, which is really what we took 4 chapters to explain, so to speak, the philosophical or the theological advantage, aside from the fact that the spheres are true. Aside from that, there's a philosophical and theological advantage to their system. And the advantage is that God, who is infinite, is able to interact with a world that is finite through a third realm, a third type of thing. There's the Creator, who is infinite. There is the creation, which is finite and limited. And then there's a third thing called godliness, which exists in between them, which is an expression of the Creator, but not the Creator himself. Now, this godliness we're focusing on is the aspect of godliness we're focusing on is the spheres, the 10 means by which God creates the world. The interesting thing about the spheres is, as we've been explaining, we've sort of been dancing around and asking questions about their paradoxical nature. Because a sphera, like let's say God's knowledge is the example we've been using as a sphera. The God's knowledge is comprised of a vessel and light, right? These are the 2 parts of the sphera. Or, which is, as it's called in Hebrew, light, and kli, which is vessel. Light in the vessel is like a soul and a body. It's only with the 2 together that you have a sphera. If you have just the vessel, it's like a corpse with no soul. It's like a body that's dead. It so to speak can't accomplish anything. It's not alive, whatever that means in this context. And the light is like the soul. The soul without a body cannot interact with things that are lower than it, just like a disembodied soul, if you could imagine it in our physical world, can't interact with the world, it can't accomplish anything. So the vessel is the means by which the soul interacts with things that it otherwise can't interact with, the things that are limited. Just like the body allows the soul to interact with the world, even though the soul is essentially a spiritual being, right? But then the question moves up to the next step. So you've explained that through the soul or through the vessel, through the body or through the vessel, the soul or the light is able to interact with the limited world. Now the question becomes, how does the soul interact with the body? The body seems to be of the world, yet the body is also different than everything else. Your body somehow is you, right? Which was at the conclusion of chapter 4, that was the whole accomplishment of the kli. The whole accomplishment of the vessel was that when we say that the God's light enters the vessel of knowledge, and through that God knows, it's actually God that's knowing. It's not something separate from Him that knows. It's God who's knowing, right? Then the question becomes, but if God is knowing, how does this not limit Him, right? How is it that the vessel, a finite vessel, can combine with the light? So you might say that the light is limited, but on the contrary, the light, as we've been explaining in our chapter, is perfectly reflective of the source. The light is something which expresses God in the fullest. The light is infinite, just like God is. So when you say God's light, you're actually saying, basically, that this limited vessel can interact with something like God. So how is it possible for a limited vessel to interact with the infinitude of God, and not just interact with, but express the infinitude of God, such that the knowledge of God is like God knowing, God Himself knowing. When the light enters the vessel of knowledge, we say God Himself knows. Which means that the vessel has to be nullified. The vessel has to be transparent to that inner reality of God somehow. And that's the big question. The question is, how can the vessel be transparent to the light if the vessel is defined and limited, right? That's the $64 million question? That's the $64 million question. To begin to answer the question, we said we have to do a series of things, right? 1 second. All right. So we said I'm going to actually go back and we're going to read it just as we did at the end of last class. So we're going to review the end of last class. I'm on page 155. 155, 3 lines up from the bottom. The pages work strangely. If you just keep turning, you'll find it eventually. 155, 3 lines up from the bottom. We say, these two questions, which is how are the spheres considered godliness when they're incommensurate to his being? In other words, how is a limited sphere still considered godliness? I think the second question at length was how can it be that God doesn't change through using the spheres, right? It's basically asking from two different angles. How can the light remain light if it unites with a vessel? And how is a vessel able to unite with the light, right? It's basically asking from the two different directions about essentially the same thing, which is what is the interaction of these two things? How is an infinite light and a finite vessel able to interact with one another, right? So if a finite vessel can interact with the light, then it's not really finite. If the infinite light interacts with the vessel, then the infinite light is not really infinite, right? That's basically the two questions. So to explain this, we have to explain why the Kabbalists call an expression of godliness light, right? As we were talking about last week, they could have called it anything, right? There's other things they could have called it. It's not, because we're obviously not talking about physical light, we're talking about a spiritual concept. And the bottom of page 155, the spiritual concept could be used. Light is just a metaphor. We could call the spiritual concept anything when we say God expresses himself. But the Kabbalists all call it light. So the question is, why is light the chosen metaphor, right? And especially, why do they not call it shefa, which is the term used by the Jewish philosophers, not the Kabbalists, but the philosophers? They call it shefa. They call it godly influence. Maimonides uses this term. Other Jewish philosophers use this term. And according to explaining why light and not influence, we will then understand the idea that God has no lacks or faults. I'm now on page 154. We go from 155 to 154. Don't ask questions. We go right to left in the English. We especially want to explain what it means that God does not become weary. What does it mean? Number one, that God lacks nothing. And number two, that God doesn't become weary, which is an interesting focus. We'll see why. We'll see the significance of that, God willing. Right? That God doesn't get tired. God is the same before he creates the world and after he creates the world. He's always the same. In other words, creating the world doesn't. The real question is, how is it that the creation of the world, we explained last week, actually, we were talking about the idea that God doesn't change from before the world is created and after the world is created. But the question is, how is that possible? How can it be that God invests energy and still is left over with an infinite amount of energy, right? Yeah, but the thing is, the whole problem is having something infinite is the whole problem. Right, that's infinity, we say infinity very casually, and infinity is a mathematical idea, but the vast majority of times infinity is used in mathematics. Infinity is potential, right? We say potentially infinite. What we're really talking about is a process, that if we let the process run forever, the process would never stop, right? That's usually in mathematics what we're talking about. But to actually have something that's infinite becomes very, very thorny, right? Like the famous example the Mashpiyim say in Yeshiva, very simple, right? If you have an infinite pile of apples, yeah, what happens if you take away an apple? What happens if you add an apple, right? So this is actually, they're pointing out you can't have an infinite pile of apples. This is really the point. There's no such thing as an infinite pile of apples.
Infinite is theoretical.
Right. So what is it? So we're going to try and understand a little bit what it means that God invests himself to create the world, but is not lacking. But that doesn't make him tired. Which, in other words, his resources are not depleted. We'll talk about that. Okay. So why light and not influence? Now, at the end of last week, I gave a metaphor. It was a long metaphor. The metaphor had to do with a teacher and a student, right? And I was explaining the difference between a student that appreciates the teacher for what the teacher teaches, and a student that appreciates merely the appearance of the teacher, or the they're happy just because the teacher shows up to school, right? And we explained that this is really the difference between light and influence, between or and shefa. That a student who's receiving the teacher, the teaching that the teacher crafts for him, is receiving influence. The student who's happy just because the teacher shows up at school, so to speak, whatever that means, is receiving light. All they do is see the teacher. They see the light reflecting from the teacher. And the question was, who does the teacher do more work preparing for? And the answer is, he should do 100% of his work preparing for the student that he teaches, not the student that's happy just that he showed up, because the student that's happy just because he showed up will be happy automatically. There's no work necessary to do. All he has to do is be there. But the student who has to be taught, that requires a lot of work. Why does it require a lot of work? Because the teacher has to take what he knows and he has to form it in a way that the recipient is able to appreciate it. As opposed to a student that's just happy seeing the teacher, it has nothing to do with the needs of the recipient. It has nothing to do with what the student needs. The student receives just by the teacher being there, right? This is a very heavy-handed metaphor. But this is the difference between or and shefa, as we're going to explain today. The difference between light and influence, or flow is another word for shefa. The idea is, second line on page 157. This is our new topic this week. The word shefa, or influence, flow, refers to an activity that comes from an expression of force from the essence of the mashpia, from the essence of the one that gives over. So the influencer, right? There's an implied relationship, right? When you say that someone is giving influence, there's an implied relationship. There's an influencer and there's an influencee, right? There's giver and receiver. The giver, the one who influences, is essentially he is transforming a potential that he has in himself, and he is making it actual for the student. In other words, he's taking something that he has, what's called a kayach. He's taking something that he has in potential, this teaching for the receiver, or this whatever it is, doesn't matter what it is, this these words or this influence, whatever it may be, and he's taking it from inside himself, and he's giving it to the receiver. The mashpia is the word for the influencer. It's a good Hebrew word to know. I might use it again by accident. So the mashpia is the influencer, is the giver. To the extent that he himself is number one, nitrad, which means he's involved, he's busy, he's caught up in the act of influence. In other words, this isn't something that just happens. This is something he has to be involved in, he has to be aware of. Number two, that he moves from his place and from his situation. In other words, following the general principle, anyone who moves is moved, right? If you move something else, right, we're actually going to see how this principle is not always true, right? But for this idea, for influence, it is true. If you move something else, you yourself, generally speaking, are moved. This is true for hashpa. This is true for influence. If the teacher wishes to give something over to the student, he has to move himself. He can't just be passive and the student will automatically receive. The teacher has to, number one, make an effort, and number two, he has to work, right? He can't just sit there. He has to form himself, or at least move his lips and give an idea over something. The teacher has to do. So these are the two, so to speak, call signs of hashpa, of influence. Is number one, the influencer is involved, and number two, they're moved. And the reason why both of these is because they're giving over of themselves. They're giving over something that they have to someone else. He has to invest his energy to give birth and to affect this action and this influence. He has to involve his energy. He has to be invested in it.
I just want to.
Yeah.
So is the implication that God is a motivated, proactive?
No, we're not. We're not talking about God yet. We're just talking about influence and light. We'll get back to what God is in a minute. We'll get there, because there's something else. There's another, right? This is just influence. Then we're going to talk about light, and then we're going to talk about how all of this applies to what we've been talking about. V'nimtza mishtana bein mekedem shemashpia. Therefore, there's a difference between his state before he influences, shahaya b'mekomoi, when he was in, so to speak, his own place. We use his own place qualitatively. We don't mean that he moved physically, right? We mean qualitatively. You have to start thinking a little bit abstractly here, right? When we say he's in his own place, what's a spiritual place? Right? There's no places spiritually. Everything is in the same place, right? When you talk about, so you talk about the four worlds, right? You have Atzilus, Bria, Yitzir, and Asiya, right? Four spiritual worlds. We don't mean four worlds in actual four different places, right? So too it actually speaks about the angels, right? We say there's depending on what you read, there's infinite angels, there's which is something like having infinite apples, which is why it's a problem. There's a letter from the Rebbe about that. But there's infinite angels, there's infinite worlds. What separates all these spiritual things? They're not in a different place physically because they're spiritual. They take up no physical. That's the definition of spirituality. They take up no physical place. Rather, what differentiates them? What's spiritual place? Spiritual place is qualitative. It's a different type of thing. All right. This is why in the physical world, what's the fundamental difference between spirituality and physicality is that in spirituality everything is one of a kind, right? In physicality, you can make 1,000 iPods and they're exactly the same. 1,000 iPhones, you say now, I guess. You have 1,000 iPhones and they're exactly the same when they come out of the factory. How are you able to have 1,000 iPhones that are exactly the same? Because you have something called space in the physical world. And space is a very useful creation. It separates between things, even if qualitatively they're exactly the same. So you can have the exact same phone 1,000 times, not in the same place, that's impossible. But in a different place, you can have 1,000 things the exact same. Spiritually, there's no such convenience, right? There's no space to separate everything one from another. If something is different, it's truly different. Right? This is part of what's meant by the idea that our world is a world of falsehood, right? Because if you have two different things, they should actually really be different, qualitatively. But in our world, that's not the case, right? That's part of what it means that the world is a world of lies, in the Kabbalah and in the Chassidic teachings. Spiritually, space is something qualitative. This is a different type of thing than the other, right? So when we say that the influencer moves from his space by having influenced, right? Before he influences, he is in his space. Milas makom, right, in the parentheses. Milas makom, when we mean his place, hulashon hashala, it's a borrowed term. Koloimar ba'atzmius mahusa. We don't mean his physical place. We mean he remains in his essence, right? He remains qualitatively who he is, right? You have a teacher who's a genius, and you have a student who is less of a genius, or you have a student who's not intelligent, right? You have a genius teacher and an unintelligent student, right? They're in different spiritual places. The teacher is his mind is of a different quality than the student. So you have the teacher who is in his place before he teaches, and then after he teaches, to teach, he has to leave his place. He cannot remain in his own quality, or the student receives nothing, right? Because the student is in a different qualitative space. So he has to descend. He has to bring a teaching down such that the student can appreciate it, and he has to bring it into expression. And this is shared with the student. After he influences, where he is involved with his energy to give over influence. V'heim kol inyane melachos hanaisim biyad v'regel. 1 second. I bridged 2 sentences there. There's a difference between him before he gives over his influence and after, when he actually involves himself and has to leave his space, right? So you're getting the idea. We're talking an active involvement, an active type of influence. The person is involved, they move, they change. There's a difference before and after. In order to do this, a person has to leave their spiritual place. This is all the idea of influence. Furthermore, this refers to page 156, top line. This refers to all the different tasks performed by hand and foot. That the faculty of motion that's in the hand, in other words, the ability to move, is expressed in work until a person becomes tired. Right. In other words, there's a limited amount of energy. Right. This shouldn't surprise anyone. There's a limited amount of energy. The energy gets invested, and the person becomes weary, becomes tired. The person runs out of energy for this task. So too, in giving over, in the giving over, or the flow of spiritual faculties. Like if a person is giving over intellect, right? A teacher who gives a difficult lecture can be just as weary and just as exhausted, perhaps even more so, depending on how difficult it is, than a bodybuilder or someone who's exercising at the gym, right? It's the same idea. Just as because the hand is invested in its work, and you're investing energy from yourself, the energy can be used up. So too intellectually, when a person is influencing, he's giving over flow, the energy gets used up, like a teacher, but can be exhausted by a lecture. Because the wisdom and intellect itself, which is invested in the brain, is caught up, is made busy, and gives birth to the influence of intellect, right? In other words, the intellect is involved. The intellect is essentially, usually when someone gives over intellect, it's in a way of influence. And that's why a person becomes exhausted by attaching himself with great depth to intellectual matters. All of these things in the Holy Tongue are called shefa, are called influence. Page 159. The amnam, so that's shefa. Amnam, lashon orhu hipuchzeh. Light denotes the opposite of all of this. She'im heyes, because even though gamke and hamshachim imakere, it too is drawn out from its source. In other words, it too, if we use the general term expression, right, both influence and light are an expression of the source. If a person is giving off both influence and light, it both comes from the person. It's both an expression of from them. Aval, however, light is a form of expression that is such that the source is not changed or moved or affected is a better word. It's not changed or affected before it gives light and after it gives light. It's the exact same. 23. The basis for this in the following concept is that light is merely radiance. It is nothing of substance, as opposed to shefa, which is, right? In other words, the light, it's like your reflection in a room, right? You turn the light on in a room, and all of a sudden everyone can see you. Now, everyone knows that your appearance is a form of self-expression, right? You wear certain clothes, or you hold yourself in a certain way, you have a certain posture that says things about you. Right? You can't deny that there's a form of self-expression that comes from being seen, from the light that comes off you. But when you give shefa, when you give influence, when you're a teacher teaching a class, that is influence,